I'm very delighted to also introduce Evan Reis. You may remember Evan. Evan was a presenter at the Spokane Summit a couple of years ago. Evan is a California structural engineer and executive director of the U.S. Resiliency Council. He works with public and private organizations to promote resilience and improve the performance of our nation's infrastructure in natural disasters. Evan graduated with his bachelor's and master's degree in structural engineering from Stanford University in 1988. Please welcome Evan Reis.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to, of course, thank Matt Morrison and his great crew for making this another fantastic conference. Bill Larson, in particular, from the Pacific Northwest Building Resilience Coalition for inviting me to speak and being such a great partner with the U.S. Resiliency Council, and Diane Warner from the Northwest Cement Council as well for all your support. And of course, a big thank you to the City of Calgary. I mean, you know, it's a little fancy for a former Newfie. I tried to find a basket of vinegar and chips last night, but apparently you don't make it here. But the beef is really good, so I really appreciate this beautiful city of Calgary to get to come to today. As Bill mentioned, I spoke in 2018 at the Spokane PWNER conference, and there I introduced the concept of building resilience, the way the U.S. Resiliency Council has been thinking about it. Our focus is on resilience to buildings in natural disasters like earthquakes, but also hurricanes and floods like the minister showed, and wildfires like you're all experiencing. My purpose back then was to talk about the sustainability movement, which has traditionally been focused on green design, right? Making sure that we have a low impact on the environment. And talking about how really sustainability is about the combination of green and resilient design. Resilient design being where the environment has a low impact on us. And if we truly want to have sustainable communities, sustainable businesses, sustainable families, we need to integrate both resilience and green design and make that our definition of sustainability. I also talked about how resilience is good for business, that there are very strong social and economic and environmental cases to be made for building resiliently. So today I want to catch you up and move the discussion forward to talk about implementing resilience policy. Now I know that obviously PWNER has a lot of legislators. I've had a great privilege of meeting several of them on both sides of the border this week. And so implementing resilience policy is the ultimate goal. We can talk about it. We can talk about the good things qualitatively that resilience does for us. But getting that into actual public policy is what I want to talk about today. I appreciated the conversation yesterday that the Lieutenant Governor of Washington had about how to make resilience turn from a good idea into actionable policy. And I've been having a wonderful conversation with Mary Dye, a state representative in Washington, also about taking these good ideas that we know lend themselves from science and turning them into reality. So from the USRC's perspective, U.S. Resiliency Council, it's our goal to bridge that gap, if you will, between science and engineering and all the reports and white papers that stack up or get put on shelves, and turning that into actionable policy, actionable measures that actually improve resilience. And we also look at it as a way to make it a win-win for all of the stakeholders involved. There are so many stakeholders that benefit from resilient design, whether they're the owner of a building itself, or the tenants of a building, lenders, insurance companies, of course the cities and counties that rely on those buildings for property taxes, sales taxes, and just of course the economic workforce. So finding ways to show that everybody wins when we build more resiliently is one of the core missions of the USRC. A little bit of a background: we were founded back in 2011. We really got started in about 2014 as a nonprofit to help sort of be a companion to the green design movement through the U.S. Green Buildings Council and others, right? The idea, again, as I said, that to achieve true sustainability, we need resilience plus green design. We were founded by 3 engineers, including myself, and also somebody in the mortgage banking industry who realized that we needed to bring more quantitative science to measuring building performance, both from a risk standpoint and also so building owners and others could make good decisions about why they should invest in resilience. My background is in earthquake engineering. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area with a small stint in St. John's, Newfoundland. And so we experience earthquakes all the time, and so it's very important part of my career to develop building designs that are resilient to earthquakes. So let me start by talking about 2 things that typically make it difficult to get resilience, to turn resilience into practice. This is our experience in a lot of work we've done around legislative initiatives, around talking to building owners and businesses. And the 2 primary issues is that natural hazard events, when we talk about catastrophic events like earthquakes or the flood in British Columbia, or of course all the floods we have around the California or the U.S. Midwest, hurricanes, wildfires, is that they are generally speaking low probability, high consequence events. They don't occur that often, thankfully, but when they occur, they're devastating, or they can be. That can cause billions, tens of billions, even hundreds of billions of dollars in damage, and cost hundreds or thousands of lives. So why are those impediments to getting resilience measures passed? Well, let's start with the high consequence. We all know the consequences, both in dollars and casualties, the social loss and the environmental loss of these kinds of disasters. Ironically, that can be a negative driver to action. And the main reason for that is liability. There's this perception, often among building owners, even among cities or jurisdictions, that if I know about a problem, then I'm liable for it. And conversely, if I don't know about the problem, ignorance is bliss. If I don't know about the problem, then I can avoid that liability if something bad actually happens. Unfortunately, that ignorance is actually in believing that you can avoid the liability by not knowing the issue. One thing we're very clear about now today is that we know where natural hazards events occur. We know that there are earthquakes all along the West Coast, right? We know there are wildfires in so many places, and floods now. The risks are in so many places in the United States and Canada. And as engineers, the engineering sciences developed far enough to know what types of buildings are vulnerable. And I'm going to talk about an example of that in a few minutes. We know that old brick buildings are vulnerable to earthquakes. We know that buildings that are built in low-lying areas are vulnerable to flood, and buildings made of certain materials or with certain site conditions are very vulnerable to wildfire. And so the idea that we couldn't know or we didn't know our building potentially was at risk is no longer really an excuse that we can use to avoid doing anything about it. The best example I can give is of the town of Paso Robles. It's on the Central Coast in California, a beautiful little area. It adopted an ordinance that required all of its old brick buildings to be seismically retrofitted. They're the most dangerous type of building for earthquakes anywhere in the country. And so they gave about 10 years for these buildings to be retrofitted. Well, after 5 years, there was a big earthquake. And this one store, 2 employees were killed in the earthquake when front of the building collapsed. Obviously, their families sued, and the defense put on by the building owner was, well, we were only 5 years into the 10-year mandate, so we had 5 more years, so we're not really liable. Well, it didn't hold up, and ultimately, the award went to the plaintiffs, a substantial multi-million-dollar award, and the reasoning was, it doesn't matter if the city gives you some sort of deadline from its perspective. Once you own a building that is hazardous, you're responsible for it. It isn't rocket science to figure out if that building was hazardous. And so you chose to delay doing action on it, so you became responsible for it. Even if the city had no ordinance at all, you would have been liable. So understanding that not knowing is not a solution to these high consequence events is important, but yet it still is an impediment to getting things done. The second issue, low probability. Okay, these events don't occur that often, right? There are things that happen all the time. When it comes to transportation, potholes are something that have to be fixed all the time, right? And planning for a major flood that will destroy dozens of bridges is not in the short term. And so when it comes to legislation, elected officials or business officials that have to meet quarterly stock returns or disclosures, those things aren't top of mind. So it's easy to push the problem down the road because you're not seeing the immediate return on investment by making our infrastructure more resilient when there are so many short-term issues to address. So those are two of the biggest problems that we found in implementing resilience. And so what the USRC has done is try to develop strategies and implement strategies that will address primarily those issues. So the first one, let's talk about the first strategy that we use is to make sure people know their risk. Part of the USRC's mission is to work with other engineering organizations, structural engineers, to make building owners and jurisdictions, insurance companies, lenders, aware of the types of risks that are out there. And we work really hard to develop public campaigns around these types of risks. The idea being that if a city, for example, starts to promote the idea or disclose the idea that, hey, we live in an earthquake zone and we have 500 old brick buildings in our city, these are our risks. If you are an owner of these buildings, you have the liability. Even if we haven't told you you have a specifically vulnerable building, if you have one, you're at risk. So that they can tell the tenants and potential residents or employees of these buildings, ask your employer, ask your landlord, if you're going into these buildings, you're going to rent in these buildings, is this one of these older type of buildings that I've heard about? So it's very important from a public education perspective that jurisdictions, cities, counties, states, provinces, make sure everybody is aware of the risk and liability that's faced. That way, the onus, again, kind of comes back on the building owner to make the decisions. I'll give you a negative example of where this hasn't worked, and that's the city of Portland, Oregon. Now, Portland, Oregon has about 1,600 old brick buildings, okay? And it's just like British Columbia and Western Washington is at risk from the Cascadia subduction zone, huge magnitude 9+ earthquake off the Pacific coast. And again, 1,600 unreinforced masonry buildings. Some of these are residences, stores, offices, churches even. And so the city tried to implement a campaign. The city knows all these buildings. You can actually find, if you look hard enough, and you have to look hard to find a list of these buildings. The city tried to implement a campaign where it required building owners, at a minimum, just to put a placard on the building saying, hey, this is an unreinforced masonry building, enter at your own risk, so that people entering the building or trying to live in those buildings could make decisions for themselves. Well, they were sued by building owners, saying that violates our First Amendment rights, and so they, withdrew that requirement. And yet they've not required any mandatory retrofit of these types of buildings. So this is a case where a city at extreme risk has not really made the public campaign strong enough to raise demand among the public for retrofitting these buildings. So our second strategy, and this is something that people have been talking about all week, which I love. I really like to hear. It's in different terms than we use it, but it's the same thought. The U.S. Resiliency Council adopted what's called the E4 principle. And as I said, we were founded primarily by engineers like myself, and we say the E4 principle is engineering in the service of equity, the environment, and our economy. The idea that we can use engineering science that's available today, regardless of the hazard, whether it's earthquake, flood, wildfire, wind, to measure the performance of buildings along those dimensions of how they impact socially vulnerable communities, how they impact our economy, and the negative impacts that buildings that are damaged have on our environment. And that has been a really salient message because so many people are interested in at least one or more of those things, different types of organizations, politicians, businesses. And so being able to talk about resilience in those terms has been really meaningful. And that leads to the third strategy that we've used, which is engagement, stakeholder engagement. It's important that everybody who potentially is affected by the resilience or the lack of resilience of buildings understands the benefits to themselves. And as I said, whether you're a tenant or a building owner, chamber of commerce, an environmental organization, a lender, an insurer, a city official, one or more of those things, the environment, equity, and our economy, will be meaningful to you. So by talking in those terms, as opposed to showing engineering calculations, we can bring on board those types of stakeholders and show that there's a return on investment for all of those players when it comes to resilience. And then our fourth strategy, finally, is to turn long-term thinking into short-term incentives. Now, we talked about low probability events, and that often turns away short-term thinkers, whether they're building owners or legislators. And so it's important, though, that we bring together the long-term thinkers, who tend to be groups like lenders or insurance companies or cities that want to be, that are around for hundreds of years or 100 years. I'm not going to get into that Vancouver, Washington, Vancouver, British Columbia argument. That got a little tense yesterday. But both cities are old. They've been around for a long time. So the city leaders want them to stay around for a long time, regardless of their name. So those long-term thinkers can recognize the long-term benefits and translate those benefits in the same way that you amortize a mortgage into a short-term incentive to help the building owners actually include resilience and invest in resilience. So let me give you an example. Bill mentioned this. On your table, there should be several single-page flyers that we put out of a success that the U.S. Resiliency Council had. And we're very proud of this. We're a very small organization, but we're very nimble, and we use those four strategies to achieve this success. It was a $250 million grant program that was signed into law by Governor Newsom of California in June, and it will allocate that kind of money as matching grants to owners of small multifamily apartment buildings. These might be 2 to 20 unit apartment buildings with soft stories, meaning they're 1 or 2 stories of housing on top of open front parking, right, where you can just drive underneath and there's nothing there. Well, those are very risky. Next to brick buildings, they're about the riskiest type of building we have in California because, there's nothing on that whole one side at the bottom when it comes to an earthquake. So these grants would go to these owners who are primarily mom and pop type owners who just, use this rental revenue. And these are predominantly lower income type properties or properties with elderly, disabled folks, and it would go to help them retrofit. The beauty behind this is that to retrofit one of these units of housing costs about $5,000 to $10,000. To build one unit of affordable housing in California costs $500,000 to $700,000. So the return on that investment in maintaining our existing housing stock is really quite meaningful. So how did we do this? How did a very small organization accomplish this huge win? Well, we started by making everybody aware of the problem. So, we put together fact sheets like this. We developed presentations that you could sell in an elevator ride. I'm not talking about the elevator ride that we took on Monday to the reception. That was like 42 floors in 2 seconds, but close enough. You could sell it in 30 seconds on an elevator ride because it was so obvious. And we made that presentation over and over again to legislators to get them enthusiastic about the bill, and then to bring people on board with supporting it. And we talked about it in terms of those 3 E's. Equity, 4 E's: engineering, equity, the environment, and our economy. We put the risk and the solution in the context of how much damage we can avoid by retrofitting these buildings. The solution itself was relatively simple, as I said, $5,000 to $10,000 to retrofit versus $500,000 to $700,000 to replace, and it's very scalable, right? Whether you had $1 million or 10 million or 100 million or $1 billion, you can still retrofit some soft stories. And so whatever we were able to get from the state, basically, whatever they were able to agree on, we could do some major work. This $250 million will probably protect 200,000 Californians once it's fully implemented. And so with that, we were able to gather together this group of stakeholders. And this is what I think I'm probably most proud of in the work that we did, is we established a coalition of 45 organizations with no opposition. And this coalition consisted of people that normally, well, let's say they don't see eye to eye. We had tenants' rights groups and apartment owners association. Both supported this bill. We had the National Resources Defense Council and other environmental groups and chambers of commerce. They both supported this bill. Cities, building officials, engineers, they all came on board because it was a solution where they could see specifically the return on investment for them. This isn't a mandate. This isn't a requirement that anybody do these retrofits, but it's a grant program where everybody benefits. And now we are seeking to actually add more benefits through talking with lenders and insurers. I have a meeting after this presentation with Freddie Mac, one of the largest US lenders, to talk about additional incentives to reduce mortgage rates for buildings that are retrofitted. So bringing together this idea of shared benefit was absolutely critical to getting the work done. So we're very proud of that work, and it's scalable not only in the project itself, but in the idea. Whether you're from California or Oregon, Washington, Alaska, British Columbia, Alberta, the other states and territories in PWNER, you can find your own issue that you can turn into real policy with these kinds of strategies is how we figure it. You need to start by dispelling the myths around things like liability and return on investment and the engineering science not being there, because it is. You need to find solutions that everybody can latch on to a piece of, and then you need to be able to turn these sort of long-term thinkers, long-term investments into short-term incentives, so that the burden of this work, whether it's retrofitting older buildings or designing new buildings to higher performance levels, doesn't have an impact too heavily on the owners. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak. It was a pleasure to see you all.